story. The wooden planks beneath Stella Morgan's boots groaned with a sound that would haunt her nightmares for years to come, a splintering crack that meant the difference between life and death on that scorching Arizona afternoon in 1883. She had been crossing the rickety suspension bridge over the Gila River Canyon, her arms laden with supplies from the trading post in Silver Ridge, when the ancient ropes finally surrendered to time and neglect. The world tilted sideways as the entire structure gave way beneath her, sending crates of flour and tins of beans tumbling into the churning waters 60 feet below. Her scream tore through the desert air as she plummeted, her skirts billowing around her like a broken parachute, the rush of wind stealing the breath from her lungs. She barely had time to register the shock of cold water before strong arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her against a solid chest as they both went under. Jack Thornton had been watering his horse at the river's edge when he heard the bridge collapse, and without a single thought for his own safety, he had sprinted toward the bank and launched himself into the rapids. The current was vicious this time of year, swollen from the mountain snowmelt, and it took every ounce of his strength to keep them both afloat as debris from the shattered bridge rained down around them. He kicked hard toward the eastern bank, one arm locked around the woman's waist while the other carved through the water in powerful strokes. She was coughing and sputtering against him, her fingers clutching desperately at his shirt, and he could feel her heart hammering against his ribs like a wild bird trying to escape a cage. They broke the surface together, gasping for air, and Jack dragged them both onto a narrow sandbar 20 yards downstream from where he had entered the water. Stella collapsed onto her hands and knees, coughing up river water while her entire body trembled with shock and cold despite the afternoon heat. Jack knelt beside her, his hand steady on her back as she struggled to catch her breath, his own chest heaving from the exertion. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes were the color of honey in sunlight, wide with fear and confusion and something else he could not quite name. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, deeper than she expected, and she shook her head even though every part of her body ached from the impact. Her dark blonde hair had come loose from its practical bun and now hung in wet ropes down her back, and her dress was plastered to her skin in a way that made her acutely aware of how improper this entire situation was, but propriety seemed laughably unimportant when she had just nearly died. "I do not think so," she managed, her voice hoarse from screaming and swallowing half the river. "You saved my life. You just dove right in without even thinking about it." Jack sat back on his heels, pushing his wet hair out of his eyes as he studied her with an intensity that made her skin flush beneath the river water still dripping from her clothes. "Could not just stand there and watch you drown," he said simply, as if risking his own life was the most natural thing in the world. "Can you stand?" Stella nodded and accepted his outstretched hand, surprised by the calluses on his palm and the gentle strength in his grip as he pulled her to her feet. She swayed slightly, and his other hand came up to steady her elbow, those dark eyes of his never leaving her face. Up close, she could see that he was probably only a few years older than her own 22 years, with sun-bronzed skin and the lean, hard build of someone who spent his life outdoors. A cowboy, she realized, noting the worn leather chaps and the hat that was now floating somewhere downstream. "We need to get you somewhere warm and dry," Jack said, already scanning the canyon walls for the easiest path up. "My camp is about half a mile north. Can you walk that far?" "Or I can walk," Stella assured him, though her legs felt like water and her teeth were starting to chatter. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving her shaky and cold despite the Arizona sun beating down on them. She looked back at the remains of the bridge, at the splintered wood and frayed ropes dangling uselessly from the canyon walls, and felt her stomach drop all over again. "All my supplies are gone. I was bringing medicine back to town. Doc Henderson needs it for the fever that has been going through the mining camp." And Jack's expression darkened with concern. "Silver Ridge? I heard about that. How bad is it?" Bad enough that people are dying, Stella said quietly, wrapping her arms around herself. I have been helping Doc Henderson for 3 years now, ever since my parents died. This fever came through last week and has already taken 4 people. We were running low on quinine and laudanum, so I rode to the trading post to get more. Now it is all at the bottom of the river. Something shifted in Jack's face, a determination settling over his features that made him look older and harder. Then we will get you back to Silver Ridge and figure out how to get more medicine. But first, you need to get warm before you catch your own fever. The climb up the canyon wall was treacherous, made worse by their wet clothes and Stella's exhaustion, but Jack stayed close behind her the entire way, his hand hovering near her back in case she slipped. When they finally reached the top, Stella could see his camp spread out beneath a cluster of cottonwood trees, a small tent, a cook fire with a coffee pot hanging over cold ashes, and 2 horses tied to a picket line. One was a sturdy bay gelding that Jack had been watering, and the other was a pretty paint mare with intelligent eyes. "Wait here," Jack said, guiding her to sit on a flat rock near the fire pit. He disappeared into his tent and emerged a moment later with a worn wool blanket and a clean shirt. "You should get out of that wet dress. I will turn my back and tend the horses." Stella's cheeks burned at the suggestion, but she knew he was right. The dress was heavy with water and clinging uncomfortably to her skin, and the desert air was already starting to cool as the sun moved lower in the sky. She waited until Jack had turned away and busied himself with checking his horse's hooves before she quickly stripped off the sodden dress and undergarments, wringing them out as best she could before pulling on Jack's shirt. It hung to her knees and smelled like leather and sage smoke, and she wrapped the blanket around herself like a shawl before clearing her throat to let him know she was decent. Jack turned back and immediately set about building a new fire, his movements efficient and practiced. Within minutes he had flames crackling in the pit, and he draped her dress over a makeshift drying rack fashioned from branches. The domesticity of the gesture, the casual care he took with her things, made something warm unfurl in Stella's chest that had nothing to do with the growing fire. "Thank you," she said softly, watching him work. "I do not even know your name." He glanced up at her, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Jack Thornton. I run cattle for the Double T Ranch about 30 miles west of here." "Stella Morgan," she replied, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I live in Silver Ridge with my aunt. I help Doc Henderson with his patients and keep house for my aunt in exchange for room and board." Jack poured coffee from his supplies into a battered tin cup and handed it to her, their fingers brushing in the exchange. The coffee was strong and bitter, but Stella drank it gratefully, feeling the warmth spread through her chest and down into her limbs. Jack settled onto another rock across the fire from her, his own cup cradled in his hands, and for a long moment they just looked at each other across the flames. "That bridge has been dangerous for years, Jack said finally, his voice tight with anger. The town council kept saying they would fix it, but they never did. Too busy arguing about whether to spend the money on repairs or on expanding the saloon. "It was not your fault," Stella said quickly, seeing the guilt flicker across his face. "And you saved me. If you had not been there, I would have drowned. If I had gotten there sooner, maybe I could have stopped you from crossing, Jack countered, but Stella shook her head firmly. "You cannot save everyone from every bad decision, Jack Thornton. But you saved me today, and I will not forget that." She took another sip of coffee, studying him over the rim of the cup. "What were you doing out here anyway? This is pretty far from the Double T, Arse." And Jack's expression grew guarded, and he looked down into his coffee. "I was on my way to Silver Ridge, actually. I have some business there." Something in his tone made Stella suspect there was more to the story, but she did not press. They were strangers, after all, thrown together by circumstance and a collapsing bridge. She had no right to his secrets, even if he now knew more about her life than most people in Silver Ridge. They sat in companionable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the desert in shades of gold and orange and deep purple. Stella's dress was still damp when the stars began to emerge, and Jack finally stood and stretched. "You should sleep in the tent tonight," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "I will keep the fire going and sleep out here. In the morning, we will ride to Silver Ridge together and see about getting more medicine for those sick folks." Stella wanted to argue, to insist that she could not take his shelter while he slept on the hard ground, but exhaustion was pulling at her bones, and her eyelids felt heavy as stones. "Are you sure?" she asked, and Jack nodded. "I am sure. Go on now. You have had a rough day." Stella rose on unsteady legs and made her way to the tent, pausing at the entrance to look back at him. He was already settling onto his bedroll near the fire, his hat pulled low over his eyes, and something about the sight of him made her chest ache in a way she did not quite understand. "Good night, Jack," she said softly. "Good night, Stella." She ducked into the tent and found it surprisingly neat and organized, with a bedroll laid out on a ground cloth and his saddlebag stacked carefully in one corner. She burrowed into the blankets, breathing in the scent of him that clung to the fabric, and fell asleep to the crackle of the fire and the low murmur of Jack's voice as he spoke quietly to his horses. She woke before dawn to the smell of bacon frying and coffee brewing, and when she emerged from the tent wrapped in the blanket, she found Jack crouched by the fire with a skillet in hand. Her dress was dry now, hanging stiff and wrinkled on the branch rack, and he gestured toward it without looking at her. "Should be ready to wear," he said, flipping the bacon with practiced ease. "Breakfast will be done in a few minutes." Stella grabbed her dress and ducked back into the tent to change, grateful for the privacy, even though she suspected Jack would have kept his word and not looked even if she had changed by the fire. When she emerged again, properly dressed if somewhat rumpled, Jack handed her a tin plate loaded with bacon, beans, and a thick slice of bread fried in the bacon grease. They ate quickly and in silence, both of them aware that they had a long ride ahead and sick people waiting for help. Jack saddled both horses while Stella cleaned the breakfast dishes with sand and water from his canteen, and then he helped her mount the paint mare with a hand on her elbow that lingered just a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Her name is Daisy," he said, stroking the mare's neck. "She has a smooth gait and a good temperament. She'll take care of you." Stella gathered the reins, feeling the mare shift beneath her weight. "Thank you for everything, Jack. I do not know how I will ever repay you." Jack swung up onto his bay gelding with an ease that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. "No repayment necessary. Let us just get you home and see about that medicine." They rode through the morning as the sun climbed higher and the desert came alive around them. Jack kept them to an easy pace, mindful of Stella's ordeal the day before, but she sat straight in the saddle and did not complain even when he could see the exhaustion pulling at her features. They talked as they rode, the kind of rambling conversation that happens between people who are just beginning to know each other. Jack told her about growing up on his family's ranch in Texas, about how he had come west after his parents died to make his own way in the world. Stella told him about her childhood in Silver Ridge, about how her father had been a miner who died in a cave-in when she was 19, and how her mother had followed him 6 months later from a broken heart and pneumonia. "That is when I started helping Doc Henderson," Stella said, her eyes distant with memory. "I needed something to do, some way to be useful. Turns out I have a knack for nursing. Doc says I have gentle hands and a calm presence, which is apparently important when someone is in pain or scared." Jack looked at her with something like admiration. "That is a hard job. Seeing people at their worst and trying to help them through it." It is," Stella admitted. "But it is also the most rewarding thing I have ever done. When someone recovers, when you see them walking around town healthy and whole again, it makes all the hard parts worth it." They crested a low rise, and Silver Ridge came into view below them, a sprawling collection of wooden buildings clustered around the opening of several mine shafts. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and Stella could see people moving through the streets, going about their daily business. But there was something subdued about the town, a heaviness that hung over it like a shroud, and she felt her stomach clench with anxiety. "I hope we are not too late," she murmured, and Jack reached over to squeeze her hand where it rested on her thigh. "We will do what we can," he said firmly. "That is all anyone can ask?" They rode down into town together, and heads turned as they passed. Stella could see the curiosity in her neighbor's eyes, the questions forming about who this handsome cowboy was and why Stella Morgan was riding into town with him on a strange horse. But she held her head high and rode straight to Doc Henderson's office, a small building near the center of town with a faded sign that read Henderson Medical Practice. Doc Henderson himself came hurrying out when he heard the horses, his lined face creased with worry. He was a thin man in his 60s with wire-rimmed spectacles and gentle eyes, and he had been the only doctor in Silver Ridge for as long as Stella could remember. "Stella, thank God," he said, reaching up to help her dismount. "When you did not come back yesterday, I feared the worst. What happened?" "The bridge collapsed," Stella said, stumbling a little as her feet hit the ground. Jack was there immediately, his hand steadying her back, and Doc Henderson's eyes flicked between them with sharp interest. "I lost all the supplies in the river. This is Jack Thornton. He saved my life." Doc Henderson shook Jack's hand with genuine gratitude. "Then I owe you a debt I can never repay, young man. Stella is like a daughter to me." "No debt necessary," Jack said, echoing his earlier words to Stella. "But we need to talk about getting more medicine to Silver Ridge. How bad is the fever?" Doc Henderson's face fell. "We lost another person last night. Mary Peterson, the school teacher. She was only 28 years old. And we have 6 more patients who are not looking good. Without the quinine and laudanum, I cannot do much more than make them comfortable and pray." Stella felt tears prick at her eyes. Mary had been her friend, one of the few women in town close to her own age. They had taken tea together just 2 weeks ago, laughing about the antics of Mary's students and making plans to go to the harvest dance in the fall. Now Mary was gone, another victim of this cursed fever, and Stella had failed to bring back the medicine that might have saved her. Jack must have seen something in her face because he stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring at her back. "The trading post in Red Creek is 2 days' hard ride from here," he said to Doc Henderson. "But I know the owner. If I ride through the night, I can be there by tomorrow afternoon and back here with supplies by the day after. Will your patients last that long?" Doc Henderson looked grim. "Some of them might, but 2 days is a long time when someone is burning with fever." "Then I will make it faster," Jack said with determination. "I will leave within the hour. Just write down what you need, and I will get it." Stella grabbed his arm, her heart hammering. "Jack, no. You have already done so much. You do not owe us anything." He looked down at her, his dark eyes intense. "Maybe not. But people are dying, Stella. If I can help stop that, then I am going to do it." She wanted to argue, to tell him that it was too dangerous to ride that hard through country that was still wild and unpredictable, where bandits and hostile Apache bands were known to roam. But she could see the set of his jaw, the resolve in his expression, and she knew that nothing she said would change his mind. So instead, she squeezed his arm and said, "Roy, then be careful. And come back safe." Something flickered in his eyes, something warm and promising, and he covered her hand with his. "I will come back," he said quietly, the words feeling like a vow. "I promise." Doc Henderson disappeared into his office and returned with a hastily scrawled list and a small leather pouch that clinked with coins. "This should cover the cost of the supplies and then some," he said, pressing it into Jack's hand. "Godspeed, son." Jack pocketed the money and turned to Stella one last time. For a moment they just stood there, looking at each other in the dusty street, and Stella felt something shift in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. Then Jack tipped his hat to her, swung up onto his bay gelding, and rode out of town at a fast gallop, leaving Stella staring after him with her heart in her throat. The next 2 days were the longest of Stella's life. She threw herself into caring for the sick, working alongside Doc Henderson to keep them cool with wet cloths and forcing them to drink water even when they were too delirious to know what was happening. 2 more people died in those terrible 48 hours, a young miner named Tom and an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen who ran the laundry. Stella held their hands as they passed, whispering prayers and promises that their suffering was over, and then she went back to the other patients and kept working because that was all she could do. She thought about Jack constantly during those long hours. She wondered if he had made it to Red Creek safely, if he had been able to get the supplies, if he was already on his way back, or if something had delayed him. She told herself that she was just worried about the medicine, about the lives that hung in the balance, but deep down she knew it was more than that. In the space of a single day and night, Jack Thornton had become important to her in a way she could not quite explain. He had risked his life for her without hesitation, had listened to her stories and shared his own, had looked at her like she was someone worth seeing. And now he was out there somewhere, riding through the wilderness because he had promised to help, and Stella could not shake the fear that something terrible would happen to him. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, when Stella was beginning to lose hope, a shout went up from the street. She ran to the window of the Henderson office and saw Jack riding into town, his horse lathered with sweat and foam, but still moving strong. Relief flooded through her so powerfully that her knees went weak, and she had to grab the window frame to steady herself. Doc Henderson let out a whoop of joy and hurried outside, and Stella followed on shaking legs. Jack dismounted stiffly, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes were bright with triumph as he pulled 2 large saddlebags from behind his saddle. "Got everything on your list, Doc," he said, handing them over. And the trading post owner threw in some extra willow bark and honey for free when I told him what it was for. Doc Henderson clutched the saddlebags like they contained gold instead of medicine, which in that moment they might as well have. "You are a miracle worker, son. Come inside, both of you. We need to get these medicines distributed immediately." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Doc Henderson measured out doses of quinine and laudanum while Stella administered them to the patients, coaxing them to swallow the bitter medicine and whispering encouragement. Jack stayed to help, fetching water and firewood and making himself useful in a dozen small ways despite his obvious exhaustion. As night fell, the fever finally began to break in the sickest patients, and by morning it was clear that they had turned a corner. No one else would die from this outbreak. The medicine had arrived just in time. Stella found Jack sitting on the steps of the Henderson office as dawn broke over Silver Ridge, his hat tipped back and his eyes closed against the rising sun. She sat down beside him close enough that their shoulders brushed, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "You did it," she said finally, her voice rough from lack of sleep. "You saved them all." Jack opened his eyes and looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his tired face. "We did it," he corrected. "You were the one who stayed up for 3 days straight, keeping them alive until the medicine got here." Stella felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. "I was just doing my job." "No," Jack said seriously, turning to face her more fully. "So you were being extraordinary. I watched you in there, Stella, the way you care for people, the way you do not give up even when things look hopeless. That is not just a job. That is a calling." She did not know what to say to that, so she just looked at him, at this man who had crashed into her life 3 days ago and turned everything upside down. He had saved her from drowning, had ridden through dangerous country to bring medicine to a town full of strangers, had stayed up all night helping her care for the sick even though he owed them nothing. And now he was looking at her like she was the extraordinary one, like she was something precious and worth protecting. "Stay?" she heard herself say, the word tumbling out before she could stop it. "Stay in Silver Ridge for a while. You look like you could use some rest, and I would like to repay you for everything you have done. My aunt runs a boarding house. I'm sure she would give you a good rate on a room." Jack's smile widened, something warm and hopeful sparking in his eyes. "I suppose I could stay for a few days. My boss at the Double T is not expecting me back for another week anyway." Relief and something that felt dangerously like joy flooded through Stella. "You're good," she said, returning his smile. "That is very good." As it turned out, Jack stayed in Silver Ridge for much longer than a few days. Stella's aunt, a formidable woman named Ruth, who ran the town's most respectable boarding house, took one look at Jack and declared him a proper gentleman despite his cowboy ways. She gave him her best room at half the usual rate and promptly began trying to fatten him up with enormous meals and constant offers of pie. Jack settled into the rhythm of small-town life with surprising ease, helping out around the boarding house in exchange for his reduced rent and spending his afternoons with Stella when she finished her work at Doc Henderson's office. They fell into a pattern over those golden autumn weeks. Jack would walk Stella home from the doctor's office each evening, and they would take the long way through town talking about everything and nothing. He told her about his dreams of having his own ranch someday, a place where he could raise cattle and horses and build something lasting. She told him about her love of healing, about how she wished she could have gone to a real medical school, but knew that was impossible for a woman with no money and no connections. They talked about books they had read and places they wanted to see, about childhood memories and future hopes. And with each conversation, Stella felt herself falling deeper under his spell. It was not just his kindness or his bravery that drew her to him, though those qualities were certainly part of it. It was the way he listened when she spoke. Like her words mattered and her opinions were worth hearing. It was the way he made her laugh with his dry observations about town life and his stories about ranch mishaps. It was the way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, with an expression that made her heart skip beats and her breath catch in her throat. She was falling in love with Jack Thornton, and the realization both terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Jack, for his part, was completely gone over Stella Morgan. He had known it from that first moment in the river when he had pulled her against him and felt her heart beating in time with his own. But the knowledge had solidified over the weeks they spent together, growing stronger with each smile she gave him and each touch of her hand on his arm. She was unlike any woman he had ever known, strong and capable and utterly fearless in the face of suffering and death. She was also beautiful, in a way that made his chest ache, with her honey-colored eyes and her quick smile and the strand of dark blonde hair that always escaped from her bun to curl against her neck. He wanted to know everything about her, to hear every story and learn every secret, and the wanting of it scared him more than any bucking bronc or charging steer ever had. The breaking point came on a cool October evening when Jack walked Stella home from a particularly difficult day at the doctor's office. They had lost a patient that afternoon, an old prospector who had lived alone in the hills and came to town too late for his injuries to be treated. Stella had held his hand as he died, and Jack had watched the grief and exhaustion wash over her face like a tide. Now, as they stood on the porch of her aunt's boarding house with the sun setting behind the mountains, she looked small and fragile and utterly spent. "I am sorry about today," Jack said quietly, resisting the urge to pull her into his arms. "I know it never gets easier." Stella shook her head, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "He was alone, Jack. He had no family, no friends, no one to mourn him. He died holding my hand because there was no one else." "You gave him comfort at the end," Jack said firmly. "That matters. That means something." A single tear slipped down her cheek, and Jack lost the battle with himself. He stepped forward and pulled her against his chest, one hand cradling the back of her head while the other wrapped around her waist. Stella went willingly, burying her face in his shirt and letting herself cry for the first time all day. He held her while she wept, murmuring nonsense words of comfort and stroking her hair And when she finally pulled back to look up at him with red-rimmed eyes, he knew he could not keep his feelings hidden any longer. "Stella," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to tell you something." She looked up at him, her breath catching at whatever she saw in his face. "What is it?" Jack took a deep breath, his heart hammering so hard he was sure she could hear it. "I have to leave Silver Ridge soon. My time off is running out, and I need to get back to the Double T, but the thought of leaving you is killing me, Stella. These past weeks with you have been the best of my life. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me. And I know we have not known each other very long, but I'm falling in love with you. Actually, I think I fell in love with you the moment I pulled you out of that river. So I need to know if there is any chance, any possibility at all, that you might feel the same way." Stella stared at him, her eyes wide, and her lips parted in shock. For one terrible moment, Jack thought he had made a horrible mistake, that he had misread all the signs and ruined their friendship with his confession. But then her face transformed, breaking into a smile so bright it rivaled the setting sun, and she launched herself at him, throwing her arms around his neck and kissing him with a passion that stole his breath away. Jack caught her easily, his arms tightening around her waist as he kissed her back with all the longing and love that had been building in him for weeks. She tasted like coffee and hope and home, and when they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers and felt his world shift into perfect alignment. "I love you too," Stella whispered, her fingers threading through his hair. "I have been trying not to because I knew you would leave eventually, but I cannot help it, Jack. I love you so much it scares me." Jack laughed, the sound giddy with relief and joy. "Then come with me," he said impulsively. "Come back to the Double T with me, or better yet, let me find us our own place. I have money saved up. We could start small, maybe lease some land and build from there. I will work hard and give you a good life, Stella. I swear it." "Are you asking me to marry you, Jack Thornton?" Stella asked, pulling back to look at him with eyes that sparkled with mischief and love. "I suppose I am," Jack said, grinning. "Though I am making a terrible job of it. Let me try again." He dropped to one knee right there on the porch, taking her hand in both of his and looking up at her like she was the sun and the moon and all the stars combined. "Stella Morgan, you are the strongest, bravest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. You make me want to be a better man. You make me believe that I can build something lasting and true. Will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a cowboy who has nothing to offer you but his heart and his promise to love you every day for the rest of his life?" Stella felt tears streaming down her face again, but these were tears of joy instead of grief. "Yes," she said, pulling him to his feet and kissing him again. "Yes, I will marry you, Jack. I will go wherever you go and build whatever life we can build together." They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the Silver Ridge Church, with Doc Henderson giving Stella away and half the town crammed into the pews to witness the union. Aunt Ruth cried through the entire service, alternating between joy at Stella's happiness and sorrow at losing her favorite niece. Jack wore his best shirt and a new pair of pants purchased specially for the occasion, and Stella wore a simple white dress that she and her aunt had sewn together from yards of lace and cotton. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife and Jack kissed his bride for the first time as her husband, the entire congregation erupted in applause and cheers. They spent their wedding night at the boarding house, in the same room Jack had been renting for the past month, and as they lay tangled together in the darkness with moonlight streaming through the window, Stella felt a peace settle over her that she had not known since her parents died. This was right. This was where she was meant to be, in the arms of this good man who had dove into a river to save her and changed her life forever. "I love you," she whispered into the quiet, and Jack pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I love you too," he murmured back, more than I knew it was possible to love someone. They left Silver Ridge 2 days later, their belongings packed onto a sturdy wagon that Jack had purchased with his savings. The town turned out to see them off, with Doc Henderson hugging Stella tight and making her promise to write, and Aunt Ruth pressing a package of food and a quilt into her hands while sobbing into her handkerchief. Stella cried too, grieving the loss of the only home she had ever known. But when Jack took her hand and smiled at her from the wagon seat, she felt her heart lift with anticipation for the adventure ahead. They traveled west for 10 days, following the old cattle trails through Arizona territory and into New Mexico. Jack had resigned from his position at the Double T and instead taken a job as foreman on a smaller ranch near the town of Socorro, a position that came with a small house and a decent wage. The ranch owner, a gruff but fair man named Samuel Wright, had known Jack's father in Texas and was willing to give the young couple a chance to prove themselves. Jack would manage the day-to-day operations of the ranch while learning the business side of things, with the understanding that if he did well, Wright would help him secure a loan to start his own spread in a few years. The house that came with the job was small and rough, just 3 rooms and a porch, but Stella fell in love with it immediately. It had a good well and a small garden plot, and from the kitchen window she could see miles of open range stretching toward distant mountains. She spent the first weeks of their marriage scrubbing and cleaning and making the little house into a home, hanging curtains she sewed from flour sacks and planting herbs in the garden. Jack worked from dawn until dark learning the ranch, coming home exhausted but happy. And at night they would sit on the porch together and watch the stars come out while making plans for their future. Stella also made herself useful in Socorro, which had no doctor but plenty of people in need of medical care. Word spread quickly that the new foreman's wife had nursing experience, and soon people were showing up at the little house with all manner of injuries and illnesses. Stella treated them all with the same gentle competence she had shown in Silver Ridge, stitching cuts and setting broken bones and dispensing advice about fevers and stomach ailments. She refused payment, knowing that most of the ranchers and farmers in the area had little money to spare, but they repaid her in other ways, with fresh eggs and milk, with help building a chicken coop and a larger garden, with friendship and acceptance into the tight-knit community. Their first year of marriage was hard but happy. They struggled with money and worked long hours, and there were nights when they fell into bed too exhausted to do anything but sleep. But there were also moments of perfect joy. The first time they made love in their own bed in their own house. The day Jack came home with a puppy he had won in a poker game. The evening Stella told him she was pregnant with their first child. That last moment especially was seared into Jack's memory. Stella had been acting strangely for days, quiet and secretive, and he'd been worried that something was wrong. But then she had taken his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach and told him that by next summer they would be parents. And Jack had felt tears of joy and wonder stream down his face as he pulled her into his arms. Their son was born in July of 1884, delivered by Stella herself with Jack's help because the nearest midwife was 20 miles away and the baby decided to come early. It was the most terrifying and amazing experience of Jack's life, watching Stella work through the pain with the same determined focus she brought to everything she did, and when she finally placed the squalling infant in his arms, Jack understood for the first time what it meant to love something more than your own life. They named him James, after Jack's father, and called him Jamie for short. Jamie was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Carolyn, and then another son named William 2 years after that. Their little house grew more cramped with each addition, but also more full of life and laughter. Jack worked his way up from foreman to partner in the Wright Ranch, and then finally to owner of his own spread when Samuel Wright retired and sold Jack a portion of the land at a generous price. Stella continued her informal nursing practice, and as the children grew old enough, she began teaching them about herbs and healing, passing on the knowledge that Doc Henderson had given her. The years passed in the way they do when life is full and busy and good. Jack built a bigger house for his growing family, a proper ranch house with 4 bedrooms and a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Stella planted roses by the front steps and kept a vegetable garden that fed them through the winter. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, celebrated births, and mourned deaths. And through it all, their love for each other only grew stronger. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Jack took Stella back to the place where it had all begun. They rode to the Gila River Canyon, to the spot where the old bridge had collapsed and sent Stella plummeting into the water. A new bridge had been built years ago, sturdy and safe, but Jack bypassed it and led Stella down to the riverbank where he had pulled her from the current. The river was lower now in the heat of summer, and the water moved sluggishly between the sandy banks. "And I was so scared that day," Stella said softly, looking out at the water. "When the bridge collapsed and I was falling, I thought I was going to die. And then you were there and you saved me." Jack put his arm around her waist, pulling her close against his side. "Best decision I ever made, diving into that river after you." Stella looked up at him, her honey-colored eyes still as bright as they had been at 22, though now there were laugh lines at the corners and threads of silver in her dark blonde hair. "I would not change a single thing about our life together," she said. "Not one moment, not even the hard parts. You gave me everything I ever wanted, Jack. A home, a family, a purpose. You gave me love." "You gave me the same things," Jack replied, his voice rough with emotion. "You made me into the man I always wanted to be. You made me a husband and a father and a rancher, but most importantly, you made me happy, Stella. Every single day for 20 years, you have made me happy." They kissed there by the river, in the place where their story began, and it felt like coming full circle. That night they camped under the stars like they had on the first night they met, and they lay in each other's arms and talked about their children and their grandchildren, because by then Jamie was married with a baby of his own. They talked about the ranch and their plans to expand the herd next year. They talked about getting older and wondered how many more years they would have together. And then they stopped talking and simply held each other, grateful for the life they had built and the love that had sustained them through everything. The years continued to roll by, bringing changes and challenges, but also blessings. Jamie took over the day-to-day running of the ranch when Jack's back started giving him trouble, and Caroline married a lawyer from Socorro and moved into town, where she opened a proper medical clinic with her mother's help. William became a horse trainer with a reputation that spread across 3 territories, breeding and raising some of the finest mounts in the Southwest. Jack and Stella became grandparents 7 times over, and their ranch house was always full of children's laughter and the chaos of family gatherings. They grew old together, their bodies wearing out slowly, but their love never diminishing. Jack's dark hair turned silver, and Stella's hands developed arthritis that made her nursing work more difficult. But they still sat together on the porch every evening and watched the sunset. They still held hands when they walked, still kissed each other goodnight, still looked at each other with the same love and wonder that had been there from the very beginning. Jack passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72, with Stella lying beside him and his family gathered in the house around him. It was a good death, the kind every person hopes for, surrounded by love and free from pain. Stella grieved him deeply as she had loved him, but she also celebrated the life they had shared and the legacy they had built together. She lived for 3 more years after Jack's death, long enough to see her first great-grandchild born and to know that the ranch would continue for another generation. And when she finally followed her husband into whatever waited beyond this life, she did so with a smile on her face and his name on her lips. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking their ranch beneath a cottonwood tree that Jack had planted the year they bought the land. Their graves were marked with simple headstones that bore their names and the dates of their births and deaths, and beneath those facts was carved a single line that told the story of their love. He dove in after her, and she saved him right back. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would visit those graves for generations, bringing flowers and stories and keeping alive the legend of Jack and Stella Thornton, the cowboy and the nurse who had fallen in love beside a collapsed bridge and built a life that lasted far beyond their own years. It was a story of courage and love and second chances, of two people who found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and chose to hold on tight no matter what life threw at them. It was, in every sense of the word, a love story for the ages, set against the wild and beautiful backdrop of the American West in its final untamed years. And though the world changed around their little corner of New Mexico, though the frontier closed and the old ways faded into memory, the love between Jack and Stella remained constant and true, a beacon of hope and proof that sometimes, when you least expect it, the person meant for you will dive into raging waters without hesitation and change your life forever. Description: when the old bridge over the Gila River collapsed in 1883, Stella Morgan thought her life was over as she plummeted 60 feet into churning waters. But Jack Thornton, a cowboy watering his horse nearby, dove in after her without a second thought. That single act of bravery sparked a love story that would span decades across the Arizona and New Mexico territories. From their first meeting amid river rapids and fallen timber to building a ranch and raising a family together, Stella and Jack's journey proves that the greatest loves often begin with the most unexpected moments of courage. Their story is one of devotion, partnership, and a love that grew stronger with each passing year under the western sky. Dive into this sweeping tale of Wild West romance and enduring love.